Hey friends, hey, welcome back to my channel. This is Aaronica Inco, where the Anco is sometimes my kids or dog or cats who will make an appearance. Today we are talking about something that I feel like needs to have more conversation to it, and that is what are some things or some mistakes that I will never make again as a sewist? Let's go ahead and jump into it. Now, if you're new here, I have been sewing for quite a bit of time. I took my one and only sewing class when I was 13. If you're like, well, how long ago was that? Yeah, that was some time ago because your girl is turning 42 this summer. So, mad long ago. But because I'm primarily self taught, that means that there were some things that I didn't learn the importance of, which is actually the reason why I love teaching so much because I get to teach the discrepancies and the things that I took some unneeded shortcuts on. And because of that, I want to share some of the things that I had to learn, unfortunately, the hard way. That, listen, some things you could take shortcuts on, but these things are not them, friends. Okay. So, this is important because I did share like the myths for sewing and dispelling some of those myths with sewing. One of the things that I do feel like I should have included in there was that it's cheaper to sew than to buy clothes because it's a yes and a no, but I do feel like that is a myth. It's a myth that it's cheaper to have someone make you your clothes or for it to just be handmade as opposed to like purchasing some ready to made items. It's not. It can be, but ultimately it's not because when we think about stuff like that, and yes, I am doing a big digression because I do feel like this should have been included. When you think about stuff like that, right? Um, a lot of times we forget to factor in the cost of our labor. Right. So like even when I am doing some bed sheet couture where I have like upcycled a bed sheet that I got for like $1 at the, Value Village or wherever I got it from, right? And granted, it only cost me that much to make, right? But I have to factor in how much time it took, how many stitches on my machine it added, which means that it adds to the wear and tear, all of the thread, the needles, etc. All of these things do cost money. And in the end, is it cheaper? Financially, possibly, maybe, maybe not. But I think that when it comes to factoring the cost of me made items, right, we really do have to factor in our mental and emotional health, right? Knowing that I have made something that fits my body perfectly and that when I slide into those pants, they are going to look amazing on this body, yada, yada, right? That is priceless. Okay, so now let's get into today because I think that this is super important. Okay, so why is this important to discuss? Because I feel like as a designer and as someone who writes tutorials and as someone who is doing this, right, there are definitely some steps that I do feel like designers add in that I'm like, we didn't even need to do that. But then there are some things that as I'm teaching, I'm like, guys, do not skip this part. I know that we are in here taking some shortcuts, but do not skip this part. And so that's what I want to speak to because there are some standard things that I will always do because I made the mistake of not doing them. And I will also share what that mistake led to. Okay, friends, because your girl's not a gatekeeper when it comes to information like this. Okay, so the first thing is I used to never mark my notches. I know, gasp. But not just not marking my notches. I used to also not mark like the circles and all of the other markings on my patterns. And I don't even want to, it wasn't recent. I think in the last like 3 or 4 years when I really got into sewing with wovens that I began to really pay attention to this, right? Because we add those markings in there for a reason because it marks the total distance that is supposed to be between 2 points. So, for example, when we are putting in our notches for say a collar stand and a collar, you definitely want to make sure that that collar stand is like hitting that seam, that shoulder seam in the right area. So that way it's lining up perfectly with your placket. So that way, when it comes to doing that top stitch overhand, it's going to go ahead and match up perfectly and you will have a nice and neat and clean looking collar stand, right? So that's really important. For my first button up shirt, I did not mark my notches. We completed it, but was a little rough. Okay. Mark your notches, people, and mark those circles and the dots and other things like that. Now, I will say that I don't ever really mark them on the legs because I do have my own kind of way that I line my legs up and I true them up and everything like that. So I do not typically do it that in that area, but around that waist, especially if we're doing like a button or a zipper fly, that circle that marks the spot where you're supposed to stop your stitching and snip in, it's important in order for you to get that front to lay down right. Okay. So don't skip over that. Okay. The other thing that I used to be very afraid to do is snip into my seam allowance. Like when, and I mean that when, and this is highlighted for me right now because right now I have a pattern that's in testing. It is a polo. So of course we're doing a placket. And one of the things that I would skip over or not do entirely is snipping those corners to the stitch line so that that way that corner would look nice and crisp and it would give me the full like whatever seam allowance I needed in order to be able to stitch that down. We see this happening a lot with welt pockets. We see this with plackets. We see this anytime that we need to kind of like do the different type of pocket where you actually have to clip in to that stitch line so that it'll create the pocket. Let me grab a pair of pants and show you. Let me just grab it. These are the co-trousers that I'm going to show you this on. But when you have your pocket that is like this and you have to clip in so that you have this space so that you can actually unfold the other side so that it can be fully enclosed in this top area. Y'all, anytime that it called for me to clip to my stitch line, I would be like, never mind, I'm not going to do that. Not understanding the impact of my ways. Okay. Clip that. But it's all in how you position your scissors, right? As I was working on my my pattern that was in testing, I did not line my scissors up the right way, and I knew better because I know how I am, and I ended up over snipping, and so I didn't snip to my stitch line. I snipped through that stitch line, and a mess was had. We still completed it because I just needed it for fit. And I'm going to still wear it because y'all already know that I believe in wearing my garments, okay? But snipping to that stitch line can be tricky. And what you're going to want to do is make sure that you're lining your scissor tip up with the end of where you need that snip to go to. Also, make sure that you're using a nice sharp pair of scissors in order to do this, and you will be fighting with that fabric way less. It'll be way more accurate. But snip to that stitch line, friends. Do not be afraid of it. It matters. Something else that I did not do was clip my curves. Sometimes I really just like look at myself in the mirror and I'd be like, girl, how did we make it this far? Because we were taking shortcuts that were not meant to be shortcuts. You know what I'm saying? It just wasn't meant to be. But here we are. Practice makes perfect, also known as mistakes make progress. That was really good. Somebody should write that down because that was all me. Anyway, clipping your curves. So what do I mean by that? When you are sewing on a curve, it is recommended, and not even just recommended, it's demanded that you go ahead and clip those curves so they legit lay correctly. So when we're talking about making bras, or if we are talking about even for that front area of the collar stand, like that right area where it meets the placket, clip all of your curves. When you clip the curves, it eases the tension that is on the fabric as it's going around the curve because it's not native for that to do that way, especially when we're talking about working with woven fabrics. You don't necessarily have to do it as much when we're working with knit fabrics because the nature of knit is to stretch, but the nature of woven is not really to stretch that way. So when we clip those curves, it allows that curve to actually lay flat, and it allows it to just go ahead and stretch around the curve that it needs to, giving you a nice, really even curvature as opposed to it being jagged or as opposed to you seeing that fabric pull. When you clip to, again, that stitch line, and it's going to give you the most beautiful curves ever. I also highly recommend using a tailor's ham in order to press that out so that that seam is actually mirroring the curve that it needs to be. Which leads me to my next one, not using tailor's hams. Y'all, I promise you that I was like, who needs all of these extra things? These things are just like, no one ever needs them. We don't need tailor's hams. We don't need clappers. Like, what? I can clap for myself. A tailor's ham is very, very helpful. I will show you the one that I made myself. And if you guys are like, hey, can you show me how to make it? I will put together a tutorial on how to do this because I do actually need a matching one. But let me show you the one that I created. So this is my tailor's ham for bra making or for cups. So I made this when I was doing the pattern that was ME 2015 for Nomi, and it's a bustier. So I had to make sure that I pressed my cups out properly. Now, when you're using a tailor's ham, it's best, of course, to go ahead and press around. Let it sit and cool on the tailor's ham. Why? Because it'll keep that curvature. One of the bigger issues that we see with pressing is that people will press and not give that press enough time to cool before you go ahead and move on to your next step. Yes, the pressing is going to make a difference, but the cooling after the pressing is what's going to hold it. We see that with curls, right? So the curler that I use or the flat iron that I use to do my hair whenever I wear it straight actually has cool air. Why? Because it sets the curl. Same thing with our tailor's ham. When we use the heat to go ahead and get the those seams pressed out nicely and having it mirror this curvature, the set comes with letting it cool on here, which is the reason why I need a second one because I only have one. So when it comes time to moving or like doing my other one, I've got to move it off of here. Chances are before it's cooled. We do see other different styles of tailor hams. They are fantastic for sleeves, especially if you're pressing out your seams for your sleeves. They are fantastic for all of that, right? So go ahead and invest in a tailor's ham. They are not that expensive. I know that at Second Stitch, which is in the back of Top Stitch where I teach at in Atlanta area, they have them for like $3 or $5. Okay, friends, go ahead and get you one. The other thing, of course, is going to be along the lines of pressing, which we'll cover entirely, is going to be, yes, the clapper. We clap for ourselves, yes, but the clapper is going to be really important for allowing what we're pressing, especially those seams, as well as bias tape and stuff like that, and giving it the opportunity to cool with having that weight on top of it. Now, I have an artisan one that I absolutely love. Not only is it nicely weighted, but it's actually beautiful. These are wonderful to have, and they are going to make a difference in your pressing and the results that you get along with them. So this, of course, is my clapper. This is, again, an artisan clapper. It's fancy. I do highly recommend this one. I've used it quite a bit, quite a few times, and we see that there is no warping, which can sometimes happen, right, when you're using maybe not a higher quality wood, but there's always going to be some kind of moisture that comes from when we're pressing. And so when you are choosing your clapper, you're going to want to use something that is a higher quality wood. I will drop the link for my actual clapper below because I do really love it. And they have so many fun designs and everything like that. Not that I'm against saying a brand, but this is not a sponsored post. So the brand doesn't actually matter. The fact that I work with the clapper does. Pressing. Y'all. If you heard me, and I've said this time and time again, I think I actually said it in the video about dispelling the myths, but if you would have heard my interview on Love to Sew, the podcast that is with my girl Helen, who owns Helen's Closet, as well as Caroline, who owns Blackbird Fabrics, I was like, I don't believe in pressing. I don't press my seams. I was only working with knits at the time. Okay. So give me a little bit of grace. But pressing, babes, I hate to iron. I hate to iron. It makes a difference though. And it makes a difference in the best way possible. So go ahead, get you an iron that you love. Okay. Get an iron that speaks to whatever you need to speak to in order for you to actually use it. Okay. But get an iron and use that iron because it makes a huge difference. That's all I can say. Don't be like me. Don't be like me. Now, I will say that with like my knit garments, I do not press as I go. I press once the garment is completed. And that's it, because a lot of times our knit fabrics are not going to really hold the press, but I am pressing my seams and things like that after I'm done. Press as you go with your woven garments because it's going to make a difference as far as making that fabric easier to work with. Okay. So we'll start there. Press everything. And I hate that I'm actually saying that, but do it. Okay. Don't be like me. Don't like fumble the bag so many times. Okay. Sharpen your blades, friends. Sharpen your blades. Okay. Now, I didn't actually have a mishap that happened with this. I've actually cut myself using a very sharp blade, which I still stand behind. I still think that that blade was doing exactly what it needed to do. I'm a stick beside her, right? Because I didn't even feel pain when I cut through myself. That's exactly how sharp your blades should always be, whether they are for your fabric shears or for your rotary cutters. Okay. Listen, the reason why it needs to stay sharp is because when it is dull, that is when it can cause a lot of issue for yourself. Okay. Um, don't play with these sharp objects. Okay. Seriously. When you are cutting through a fabric and you feel like your scissors are not going through, what do? We end up putting like both of our hands in there and we're like trying really hard. We're pushing down super hard. And what happens if that now is on your finger? Now we're in danger. Same thing with our rotary cutters. If we're going back and forth and we're doing all of this and we've got a hand down and we're doing this, I was watching someone do this in class and I was like, friend, let's not do that. What's going to happen when once you get through, because you're going back and forth and you're not doing controlled movements and then you just go and cut through your hand or you miscut your fabric. These things can be avoided by making sure that one, your rotary cutter and your fabric shear blades are nice and sharp. Two, if you are using a rotary cutter, that your mat is actually a self-healing mat and it's not retaining the cut marks from the rotary cutter, okay? These things matter for safety. That's why we're including that, not because your girl fudged up. Because I like to change mine often. I use now I feel like the Tula Pink like blades are top tier as far as sharpness goes with my rotary cutter. So I do splurge and I buy those, but I do also feel like they last longer. But you can buy a pack off of wawak.com very, very easily to replace them. Um, Unfortunately, Joann's is going out of business in many areas, so you can go ahead and grab your refills there as well. Especially if you like to use the smaller size rotary cutter, like the 28 millimeter, not just the 48.5. So grab hold, stock up on those, especially if you are a rotary cutter bae like me. Okay. Don't play about those. Make sure that you get those. Okay. For sure. Not something to play with. One of the other things that I hate using is pins. Anyone who's taken a class with me or who sees me sew knows that I hate using pins. I still hate using pins. Okay. I was making my trousers, the leopard print ones, and I dragged and like, I don't know if you can still see this indentation on my finger, but I dragged my finger accidentally across this damn pin because I was trying to pin my belt loops in place. Use pins. Use pins, clips, magnets, especially if you are a sew tights baddie like myself. Go ahead and use what you can. The reason being is because like when you do things like put your belt loops in place, or for example, like when it comes time to put our pockets in place, right? It's going to make it so much easier when you are not over here trying to figure out how to hold your fabric in place. Now, I'm not going to say I pin entire projects because I do not, but using those pins will definitely help. Do not sew over those pins. Don't do it. Okay. But if you're doing a collar, the collar stand and the collar are just standing out to me again because I just finished teaching a class for the Butano button up, as well as I've got a pattern and testing where we're doing collars. Use pins. It's going to help you with stitching in the ditch around that collar area. It's going to help give you the security that you need in order to successfully sew those areas together. So whether it is in the placket area, whether it's in the collar area, whether it's in the cuff area, whether it's on the pockets, those areas really do need pins. Also, very similar, when we are doing and I actually have to replace this because you guys, how did my zipper come out? So mad about that. But when it comes time to actually putting in our fly and pinning and doing our top stitch over in this area, pinning is very, very important. So get some sharp pins. Don't reuse your pins too often, especially if they're starting to feel dull. I feel like there's a way I can get this back on. I'm going to have to figure it out because I don't think I'm going to take that out. But go ahead and make sure that you are using fresh pins to make it easier for you to actually pin. Don't skimp on that step. It's going to eventually impact the overall feeling and the overall finish of your garments. So go ahead and whip out those pins. You know it's going to take a lot for me to do that, but I still stand by it. Okay. Next thing, interfacing friends. Y'all, I used to see something that said to use interfacing, and I would be like, I don't need interfacing. And then I would tear a hole in it because it was for like a button loop or for a button area. Use your interfacing. I've heard a lot of people talking about their insecurity when it comes to choosing interfacing. And I said this the other night. As a rule of thumb, unless I'm doing something like bag making or working with like jackets or something like that, I will typically have my fabric and my interfacing weights match. So if I'm using a stretch knit and I have to interface, so for example, I've got to interface these colors for these polos, I'm going to be using a stretch fusible interfacing. If I am using a lightweight fabric that needs interfacing, I'm going to use a lightweight interfacing. Now, this changes when we get into like bag making because like if for example, I want my bag to have a lot more stiffness, I'm going to use a heavier interfacing. Just like if I'm doing woven, now I will likely never use the sewing interfacing even though I have it because I just prefer fusible. But sewing interfacing is definitely something that will add to a professional finish. So definitely by all means, grab hold of it, use it. But if you're insecure about choosing or using your interfacing as just a standard rule of thumb, go ahead and have it match the weight of the fabric. And remember that interfacing is like a stabilizer, right? Yes, we call stabilizers, especially if we're doing something like embroidery. But interfacing functions as a stabilizer when it is being used. When we think about how we add interfacing to a placket, right? It's because we've got to stabilize that fabric so that way we can go through it with all of those punctures of the needle for doing things like adding buttons or making our buttonholes. So it's stabilizing that area. So when you're thinking about how much stabilization you need in the area that is calling for a stabilizer for an interfacing, think about how firm you want that. Now, for me, like I like to have a firmer collar. I'm not going to lie. And the reason why is because sometimes you're going to want to pop that collar and I want that collar to stand up, babe, because what is the point in popping a flaccid collar? None. Okay. So for my collars, I actually do prefer a more firm interfacing because I'm going to pop that collar and I want that collar to stand up. Okay. So just make sure that you are being mindful about that. Don't skip the interfacing because you're insecure about it. Fusible will likely be your best friend, especially when you are getting into interfacing, but definitely do not steer clear of that step because it will not make you happy. Now, let's talk about some stitching. I like to top stitch. I like having top stitch. And as we can see on these code trousers that are a great example for all of the talking that I'm doing throughout this here video. So for example, here we can see that I did go ahead and I didn't top stitch in this bright limoncello color chartreuse. I did it in a variegated thread. Why? Because I like to actually add some additional design, je ne sais quoi, to my pieces with top stitching. But if your pattern is calling for a top stitch or an understitch, do it. The reason being is because the pattern is calling for that so that it can give you a nice crisp look. So for example, with this original pocket that I showed you, I did do my top stitch. My top stitch is making that look nice and crispy, right? So if I did not top stitch, then that inside or the pocket could be falling, like coming through or making kind of weird bubbles or not looking as crisp in that area. Also, when it comes time for me to wash these, if I ever get around to putting the waistband on, y'all say a prayer for your girl that I can find that piece. When it comes time to wearing, right? And you are washing it, This area is going to stay crispy regardless of whether you come out and press it. So be mindful about your top stitches and your under stitches. Don't skip that step at all. So like over here, I top stitched as well. And I'm not talking about around this area. I'm talking about here. Nice and crispy. So you can use your top stitch if you're into adding kind of like that design element in there. And I like to tell my students that that is an excellent opportunity to go ahead and add a little bit more personality into your pieces by adding a fun colored top stitch. So, what are some things that you have maybe used a shortcut for that now you're like, oh girl, I would never, now that I know? Because of course we know when we know better, we do better. And with that, drop your comments below. I want to see the things that you guys have done that you are never going to do again. And let this be a learning opportunity for our beginner baddies who are trying to take some shortcuts, but taking that shortcut might actually end up making things worse for you. But you already know how I'm going to end this. I hope that you are staying creative and sewing happily. Stay delulu because that is the Sululu.